Good evening, dear listener. I'm glad you're here. Let your shoulders loosen, let your jaw soften, and allow the day to drift a little farther away. There's nothing you need to solve right now, nothing you need to carry. Just take your time, breathe slowly, and settle in as if you're being tucked into a quiet, warm place. This story is made for late winter nights, for slowing thoughts, for gentle comfort, for the kind of calm that feels like being safely held. If your eyelids grow heavy as you listen, that's perfect. You can rest whenever you're ready. The snow had been falling for hours, the kind of steady, patient snow that didn't argue with the wind, didn't rattle the windows, didn't insist on being noticed. It simply arrived and kept arriving, softening the edges of the city until streetlights wore halos and footsteps sounded like hushes. He left the last warm cafe on the corner without finishing his drink. Not because it was bad, everything had been fine. Fine had become a word that meant too many things. The cafe had been bright, full of little clinks of spoons, and the bright laughter of people who still had something left for the day. He wanted something quieter than fine, something that asked less of him. So he walked, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders rounded against the cold, breath gathering and disappearing. The sidewalks were mostly empty now. Most windows had turned dark. A few were lit, kitchens with a lamp over a sink, living rooms where a television glowed with sound turned low. Behind glass there were other lives, snug and private, like scenes in snow globes. He didn't feel lonely exactly. He felt unmoored, like a boat that had reached the end of the pier and kept drifting. The street he found himself on was not one he usually took. It bent slightly, as if trying to avoid something, and the buildings leaned in close. Snow had filled the narrow spaces between parked cars, and the air smelled faintly of chimney smoke and clean, cold stone. He paused at a crosswalk and listened. There was almost nothing to hear. The city's usual low thunder had retreated, swallowed by weather and hour. Somewhere far off a train side, somewhere nearer, a traffic light clicked softly as it changed. The snow itself made a sound, if you listened closely, like the smallest shiver of silk. He turned down a side lane, not sure why. It felt instinctive, like following the gentle pull of a dream. The lane was lined with old shops, the kind that had weathered decades and chosen to remain. Their signs were modest, their windows framed in wood, their doors solid. Most were closed at this hour, Their interiors were dark and tidy. But halfway down the lane, tucked between a tailor's shop and a place that sold antique lamps, there was a window glowing warmly. The light wasn't harsh or modern. It was the color of honey held up to a candle. In its gentle glow, the falling snow looked slower, as if it had all the time in the world. Above the window hung a sign painted in careful letters, "Open late." It didn't name the shop. It didn't promise bargains or new arrivals. It simply said "open late," as though that were a comfort in itself. He stepped closer. The window display was simple. A stack of books arranged like a small, uneven tower, a sprig of pine tucked beside them, and a teacup painted with tiny blue flowers. No tinsel, no glittering advertisements, just the quiet suggestion of warmth. The glass fogged slightly when he leaned in. Inside he could see shelves, tall ones reaching nearly to the ceiling, and between them, lamps with soft shades. A small stove sat in the back, black iron with a curved belly, and he could almost imagine the sound it would make. A gentle crackle, the occasional tiny sigh as a log settled. He didn't remember deciding. He simply found his hand on the doorknob. The metal was warm. That stopped him for a heartbeat. The world outside was all cold and glassy air. The doorknob should have been chilly at least, but it felt as if someone had just held it, or as if warmth lived in the shop and reached through, offering itself. He opened the door, and a bell above it rang, a soft, round sound that didn't startle. It was the kind of bell that seemed to say, "You're here now. That's enough." Warmth met him like a shawl placed over his shoulders. Not a blast of heat, but a steady, caring warmth that reached through his coat. The air smelled of paper and ink and old wood, and beneath that, something faintly sweet beeswax, maybe from candles, or honey from tea. The scent of books was present in layers. The crisp, clean note of newer pages, the deeper, slightly vanilla note of older paper, the quiet mineral smell of bindings that had been held by many hands. He stood just inside the doorway, letting the door close behind him. Outside, the snow continued, but the sound of it was now muffled. The shop held silence like a cup holds tea. "Good evening," said a voice, not loud. He turned. Near the counter sat a person, perhaps a woman, perhaps someone whose features refused to settle into a single definition, wearing a cardigan the color of oatmeal. Their hair was pinned loosely, as if they'd done it without a mirror. Their face had the calm look of someone who wasn't surprised by anything, including late-night strangers arriving with snow on their sleeves. "Good evening," he replied, and realized his voice automatically lowered, as if the room requested it. The person smiled, not in a way that demanded a smile back, but in a way that made room for him to simply be as he was. "Come in, you must be cold." "I didn't know this place was here," he admitted. "It's here when it needs to be," they said, as if commenting on the weather. "You're welcome to browse. If you're looking for something in particular, you can tell me. Or you can just wander. Wandering is allowed." Wandering sounded like exactly what he'd come for. He moved deeper into the shop. The floorboards were old and dark, polished by time. They didn't creak loudly, they murmured, as if they were careful not to disturb the books. The shelves were arranged in gentle aisles, not too narrow, not too wide, like pathways in a small indoor forest. Each shelf was full, but not crowded in an anxious way. Books stood upright shoulder to shoulder, and some were stacked horizontally like little resting animals. Here and there, small objects sat among them. A smooth stone, a pressed leaf in a frame, a tiny hourglass with pale sand. The objects didn't feel like decorations. They felt like bookmarks left by the building itself. He walked slowly, letting his eyes move over spines. Titles caught and released him. Some were familiar, others seemed almost impossible. A book called The Quiet Cartography of Dreams. Another titled How to Fold a Storm into a Pocket. There were children's books illustrated with soft watercolor animals. There were fat novels with frayed corners and thin poems bound in linen. He reached out and touched a spine at random. The cloth felt warm too, as if it had been sitting near the stove. He pulled the book free and opened it. The pages released a scent like dried flowers. The text was small and neat, the paper slightly rough under his fingertips. Few sentences in, his mind began to slow in the pleasant way it did when reading something that didn't demand effort, only attention. He closed the book again, not because he didn't like it, but because he wanted to keep moving, to let the shop show him what it held. Tonight felt like a night for being guided gently. The stove in the back made a small popping sound, as if to confirm it was real. He drifted toward it, passing a table where a lamp cast an oval pool of light over an open notebook. A fountain pen lay across the page, uncapped, as though someone had stepped away mid-thought. The handwriting handwriting on the visible line was elegant and calm. When you cannot sleep, look for the warmest light you can find. He didn't know why, but seeing that sentence loosened something in his chest. Near the stove, there was an armchair upholstered in deep green velvet, worn smooth on the arms. Beside it, a low table held a tray with a teapot and 2 cups. One cup was empty. The other was steaming faintly. He stopped, uncertain. This felt intimate, like entering someone's living room. The person at the counter called softly, as if they'd read his hesitation. Tea. He hesitated a moment longer, then nodded. If that's all right. It's already made, they said. Winter asks for tea. He moved toward the tray. The steam carried the scent of chamomile and something richer. Honey, he realized. There was a small jar beside the teapot, its lid off, a spoon resting in golden thickness. A folded wool blanket lay draped over the back of the velvet chair, thick, soft, woven in a pattern of gray and cream. It looked like the kind of blanket that remembered every person it had warmed and was happy to remember more. He sat carefully, as if the chair might not want him, but it welcomed him. The velvet was cool at first, and then warmed to match him. He took the blanket and settled it over his lap and shoulders. The wool smelled clean and faintly like cedar, as if it had been stored with care. It also carried a subtler scent, something like sunlight caught in fibers. The blanket had weight, comforting weight, like a steady hand. He poured tea into the empty cup. The teapot was heavy, ceramic, painted with small moons around its belly. The tea flowed a soft golden color. He added a spoonful of honey, watched it fall in slow ribbons and dissolve. When he lifted the cup, warmth spread into his hands. He sipped. The taste was gentle, floral chamomile, sweet honey, and a hint of something else, maybe lemon peel, maybe a spice too shy to announce itself. He let his eyes half close. The stove crackled softly. The sound wasn't sharp. It was the quiet conversation of wood becoming heat. Each little snap felt like punctuation in a lullaby. The person from the counter came closer, moving with the same careful quiet as the shop itself. They didn't invade his space. They stood near enough to be present, far enough to let him breathe. Looking for something, they asked. He could have said many things, peace, an ending, a beginning, a way to turn off his mind. But what came out was simpler and honest. A book for sleep, he said, and gave a small, embarrassed laugh. Not boring, just something that helps. The person's eyes softened, as if this request were both common and precious. A book for sleep, they repeated. Not a book that knocks you out, but one that walks you gently to the edge of rest. Yes, he said. The word felt like a sigh. They nodded. You can find those in many places, but this shop tends to collect them. Stay here with your tea. I'll bring some options. He watched them move away, the soft sound of their slippers barely audible. They disappeared between shelves, as if sliding into the pages of a story. He sat and sipped and listened. The shop had its own quiet, not an empty quiet, but a full one. The hush of paper and wood and fabric, the small breathy sound of the stove, the faintest tick of a clock somewhere he couldn't see. Even the light seemed quiet. Lamps wore shades of cream and pale amber, and their glow pooled on tables and softened corners. The overhead lights, if there were any, were off. Everything here insisted on gentleness. Outside the window near the chair, snow drifted down, visible in the lamp glow like falling feathers. The glass was slightly frosted at the edges, as if the cold was trying to intrude, but had been politely turned away. He took another sip. The honey lingered on his tongue, warm and calm. He realized his breathing had slowed. His shoulders had dropped. Even his hands, which often felt tense without him noticing, now rested loosely around the cup. He looked around again, letting his gaze roam over the shelves. Some books had tiny tags tied around them with thread, like gifts. Others had pressed flowers tucked beneath their ribbons. It occurred to him that none of the books were wrapped in plastic. Nothing was sealed away from touch. The shop seemed to believe in the simple healing of holding something real. He reached toward a nearby shelf and pulled a book free at random. Its cover was cloth-bound, pale blue, with a small illustration embossed in gold. A sleeping fox curled around a lantern. He opened it. The first pages were illustrated, not brightly, but with warm watercolor tones, soft browns and creams, and muted greens. A rabbit in a scarf, a field under moonlight, a kettle steaming on a windowsill. Each picture looked like it had been painted by someone who understood quiet. The text was sparse, more like a series of gentle scenes than a plot. He read a paragraph about a small house at the edge of a forest where the windows always glowed, and travelers who were tired found their way there without knowing how. The words seemed to carry warmth in their rhythm. He didn't rush. sentence was a small stone placed carefully on the path toward sleep. Footsteps returned. The shopkeeper, if that was what they were, came with 3 books stacked in their arms. They set them on the table beside his tea. "I brought a few," they said softly. "You can choose, or you can simply look at them and let your hands decide." He smiled faintly at that. "My hands know things the mind argues with," they said, and their tone held no mystery for mystery's sake. It was simply how this place worked. "This one," they indicated the top book, "is full of short stories that end before they become too sharp. This one," they touched the second, "is poems about winter and hearths and small kindnesses. And this one," their fingers rested on the third, "has warm illustrations. It's often chosen by people who want their thoughts to become softer." He glanced at the third book. Its cover showed a small bookstore drawn in gentle lines, its windows glowing. Snow fell around it, and in the doorway stood a person holding a book as if offering it. The title was simple, "The Book for Sleep." He laughed very quietly. "That seems direct." The shopkeeper's smile deepened, still calm. "Sometimes what you need doesn't hide behind clever names." He set down the Fox and Lantern book he'd been reading and reached for the Book for Sleep. The cover felt slightly textured beneath his fingers, like linen. It was warm again, as if it had been waiting near the stove. When he opened it, the pages were thick and creamy, and the illustrations were indeed warm, soft ink and watercolor, as if painted by lamplight. The first image was of a mug in 2 hands, steam curling upward. The second was of a snowy street with footprints leading toward a small shop with an open sign. The third was of a chair by a stove with a blanket draped over it. He paused. The illustration matched where he sat so closely that it sent a small shiver through him. Not fear, never fear, just a gentle awe, like noticing a coincidence that felt too kind to be random. He turned the page. The text was written in a font that looked almost hand-set, the letters slightly imperfect in a human way. Words began. "There are places that keep their doors unlatched, not for everyone, but for those who arrive with tired eyes and careful hearts. These places do not ask for explanations. They offer warmth. They offer a chair. They offer a page to rest on." He swallowed, and his throat tightened a little with something like gratitude. The shopkeeper watched him read, then stepped back, returning toward the counter without another word. They seemed to understand that the book had taken over the conversation. He read on. The book described, in calm scenes, a person walking through snow. The way streetlight turns flakes into slow gold. It described a doorknob warm to the touch, a bell that rings softly. It described the smell of paper and the way wool blankets hold heat. It described tea sweetened with honey, the way the sweetness doesn't shout, but simply stays. As he read, the shop around him seemed to echo the book, or perhaps the book echoed the shop. He couldn't decide which came first. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe this was what comfort was, a loop of warmth feeding itself. His eyes moved over the illustrations. One showed shelves full of books, each spine a different shade of calm. Sea glass green, dusk blue, warm brown, moonlit gray. Another showed the stove, its little door cracked open to reveal orange coals. Another showed the same velvet chair, the same blanket, the same cup of tea, steam rising in slow curls. He turned the pages slowly. He wasn't trying to get to the end. The end wasn't the point. Outside, snow continued. Inside, the shop held him. After a while, he didn't know how long the shopkeeper returned with a small plate. On it sat 2 thin slices of bread spread with something pale and glossy, and a few dried apricots. The scent of toasted grain and fruit drifted up. For later, the shopkeeper said, setting the plate down gently, "In case your body needs something sweet before sleep." "That's very kind," he murmured. "It's easy to be kind here," they replied. "The walls remember." "The walls remember," he repeated, and found he believed it without needing proof. He took a small bite of the bread. It tasted like butter and a hint of salt, simple and grounding. The apricot was chewy and sweet, like captured sunlight. He read another page. The book spoke about how sleep is not an enemy to conquer, but a friend to meet. It suggested, in quiet sentences, that you don't have to chase sleep. You only have to stop chasing the day. He felt his thoughts begin to loosen like knots undone one by one. Images from earlier messages, errands, conversations floated up and then drifted away again, as if the warmth of the shop melted their sharp edges. He read about a traveler in the book who found a shelf labeled gentle things. On that shelf were books that never shouted, books that spoke softly, books that didn't twist the heart too hard. The traveler selected one and sat by the stove, and the shopkeeper offered tea. He smiled to himself, so softly it barely moved his face. He turned another page and found an illustration of hands holding an open book, the fingers relaxed, the page corners slightly curved. Beneath it, the text read, "If your eyes begin to blur, let them. If your thoughts begin to wander, let them. There is nothing you must hold on to tonight. Even the story will wait." He paused. His eyes did blur, just a little, not from tears, but from softness. He blinked, and the letters steadied again. But the message remained: permission. Permission was perhaps the most precious thing in the world at midnight in winter. He leaned back in the velvet chair, feeling the wool blanket settle. It had a faint scratchiness in the way real wool does, but it wasn't unpleasant. It was real, reassuring. He shifted the blanket higher over his shoulders. The warmth from the stove met it, and together they made a small, safe climate around him. He took another sip of tea. It was cooler now, but still warm enough. The honey remained steady and gentle. He licked a tiny bit from his lip and smiled again, almost amused by how comforting something so simple could be. He read another scene. In the book, the traveler stood up and wandered the aisles. The shop was quiet, but not empty. The shelves seemed to breathe. The titles changed when the traveler wasn't looking, offering what was needed. The traveler reached for a book and found it was heavier than expected, not with weight, but with comfort. As he read this, he glanced up at the real shelves. In the corner of his eye, he could have sworn a book shifted slightly, as if settling into place. He didn't feel alarmed. The movement felt like a cat turning in its sleep. He read on. The traveler in the book found a shelf of atlases that mapped not countries but feelings. The map of calm, the atlas of rest, the guide to gentle evenings. The traveler opened one and saw pages filled with soft drawings of rooms, windows with frost, lamps with shades, chairs with blankets, hands holding mugs. He turned a page in his own book and found, indeed, a drawing of a map, not of streets, but of a small sequence. Door right, arrow bell right, arrow warmth right, arrow shelves right, arrow tea right, arrow chair right, arrow blanket right, arrow page right, arrow sleep. He let out a tiny breath he didn't know he'd been holding. It wasn't that the book predicted his night. It was that the book and the shop were cooperating, like two hands arranging a pillow. He looked toward the counter. The shopkeeper sat there again, reading their own book, a small one with a cracked leather spine. Their posture was relaxed. They didn't watch him in a way that made him feel observed. They were simply there, like a lighthouse that didn't need to shout its presence. He returned his gaze to the page. The book for sleep continued with gentle instructions disguised as story. How the traveler let their boots dry near the stove, how they loosened their scarf, how they allowed their body to feel heavy in the chair, how they stopped rehearsing tomorrow. He felt his own body mirror those actions without him deciding. He loosened the top button of his coat. He let his head rest more fully against the chair's back. He adjusted the blanket so it covered his feet completely. The wool held heat and smelled faintly of something comforting, cedar and clean cloth, and maybe a trace of lavender. His eyelids lowered for a few seconds. He opened them again slowly. The page was still there. The words were patient. He kept reading. At some point, the book described the shop's special habit. It did not have ordinary hours. It opened when someone needed it. The sign in the window didn't list a schedule because the shop did not belong to the clock. It belonged to the moment when a person's mind needed a soft place to land. He thought about all the nights he'd spent staring at his ceiling, feeling time move too fast and too slow at once. He thought about how often he'd tried to force himself to sleep, as if sleep were a door he could kick open. He thought about how strange it was that tonight he hadn't forced anything. He'd simply walked, found a warm handle, and stepped into quiet. The book said, "Some doors appear when you are ready to be gentle with yourself." He let that settle. He turned another page and found an illustration of a shelf labeled for late winter. The books were wrapped in soft colors. A small pine branch lay across the shelf like a blessing. Beneath the illustration, the text described the smell of late winter. Snow, smoke, wool, the faint promise of spring hidden deep under ice. It spoke of how the body remembers seasons, how winter invites rest, how it is natural to be tired when the world itself is quiet. Outside, the snow pressed lightly against the window. It didn't demand anything. It simply fell and fell, as if practicing patience. He realized his teacup was nearly empty. The shopkeeper must have noticed, because they stood and moved toward him again with the teapot. "More?" they asked in a whisper. He nodded. Words felt like too much now. They poured. The tea made a soft sound against the cup, like a small stream. They added honey without asking, a slow swirl of gold. The scent rose again, warm and sweet. "Thank you," he murmured. his voice barely there. "You're welcome," they said. "Take your time, take your time." The phrase felt like a gift. How rarely did anyone mean it? The shopkeeper returned to the counter. He returned to the book. The next pages told a story within the story. A small child once came into the shop on a snowy night, clutching a book that had lost its cover. The child had been afraid of the dark. The shopkeeper had given the child a candle in a jar and a book of illustrations, warm pictures of kitchens and quilts and animals sleeping in nests. The child had sat by the stove and, without noticing, fallen asleep mid-page, their head tipped to one side. The shopkeeper had covered the child with a wool blanket and kept the stove fed until morning. The illustration showed the child asleep, the book open in their lap, the candle's light trapped safely behind glass. The warmth of the scene seemed to seep out of the page. He felt something in his chest soften further. Not sadness, not longing, just a quiet recognition that gentleness had existed in the world long before him and would exist after. That he was allowed, at least for tonight, to borrow it. He turned another page and found a list of small comforts, written as if in the margin by a friendly hand. The smell of paper when you open a book, the way wool blankets hold heat like a secret, the sound of a stove telling you the fire is still there, the sweetness of honey, steady and kind, the softness of light when it doesn't try to wake you, the quiet of snow teaching the world to whisper. He read the list twice slowly, and each item seemed to anchor him. He set the book down for a moment and simply sat. The room around him was steady. The stove crackled. The lamps glowed. The shelves stood like guardians of quiet. The snow continued its slow work outside, building a thicker hush. He lifted the book again and read on. The traveler in the book began to notice something. The shop responded not to questions, but to needs. The traveler didn't have to say, "I am tired." The shop already knew. The traveler didn't have to confess, "I am afraid the night will be long." The shop had already lit the lamps. The traveler didn't have to ask for permission to rest. The chair had been waiting. He felt that same response in the real shop. He hadn't explained his day. He hadn't described his worries. No one had asked him to. He realized, with a small wonder, that the shop did not care why he needed peace. It only cared that he did. The book for sleep continued with images of other visitors, brief glimpses, like soft cameos. elderly man with snow in his beard who came to read poems aloud to himself in a whisper. A young woman with red eyes from crying who sat with a blanket around her shoulders and traced illustrations with her fingertip until her breathing steadied. A person in a nurse's uniform who fell asleep for 20 minutes in the velvet chair, head back, mouth slightly open, the kind of sleep that saves you. Each visitor left quietly. Each one looked a little less burdened as they went. Some took books with them. Some left books behind. The shop seemed to accept both as natural. He wondered if he would take a book tonight. He didn't know. He liked the idea of carrying a piece of this warmth back into his own home, where his rooms sometimes felt too sharp. But he also felt that the true book for sleep might not be something you owned. It might be something you visited. He read on. The story described the shop's shelves as if they were arranged by feelings rather than categories. There was a shelf for gentle beginnings, one for soft endings, one for quiet adventures, one for things that will be all right even if you don't know how yet. He smiled at that last one. The smile came with a small easing in his throat. He turned another page. The illustration showed a close-up of a book page, with the fibers of the paper visible, and the text described the sensation of fingertips on paper, slightly rough, slightly warm. The way paper gives the mind something to hold that is not a phone, not a glowing screen, not a stream of endless noise. He rubbed his thumb lightly along the edge of the page, feeling the tiny texture. The paper felt thick and real. He inhaled. The smell of the page was comforting. A mix of ink and pulp, and the faint vanilla sweetness of good paper aging well. It smelled like time being kind. The stove made another soft pop. He listened to it as if it were speaking in a language older than words. Fire saying, "I am here. I am steady. I will not abandon you in the cold." He read another gentle paragraph about how the shopkeeper kept the stove lit, not only for warmth, but because fire's sound was a kind of company. Silence could be too empty for some people. The stove filled it with small, reassuring noises. His eyes drifted toward the stove. The little iron door was shut now, but a faint orange glow traced the edges. He imagined the coals inside like sleeping embers, each one a small heart. He read another page. The traveler in the book asked the shopkeeper, "Why do you keep this place open so late?" The shopkeeper in the book replied, because nights are when people finally stop pretending they are not tired. He swallowed. That line felt true in a way that didn't sting. It simply was. He read on. The traveler asked, "Does it ever get lonely here?" The shopkeeper answered, "No. The books keep me company. And the people who come here do not arrive to take, they arrive to rest. Rest is quiet, but it is not lonely." He let that sink in. Rest is quiet, but it is not lonely. He had often mistaken the two. He'd often filled his evenings with noise simply to avoid the feeling of being alone with himself. But here, in this shop, the quiet didn't feel like isolation. It felt like belonging to something gentle. The tea was half gone again. He took a slow sip. The warmth traveled down his throat and spread into his chest. His eyelids drooped. He blinked slowly. The page swayed slightly, not because the room moved, but because his body was beginning to release its grip on alertness. He read another page anyway, letting the words be soft in his mind. The book for sleep described the traveler finally finding the exact book they needed, not by searching harder, but by relaxing their hand and letting it drift along the shelf until it stopped on its own. The traveler pulled the book out and found it was filled with illustrations of warm places. A cat sleeping on folded laundry, a mug of cocoa on a windowsill, a child's mitten drying near a stove, a forest at night with snow on branches like sugar, a small shop window glowing in winter. He glanced down at the book in his lap and realized he'd already found it. The illustrations he'd been turning through were exactly those kinds of warm places. It was as if the book had been built from the material of comfort itself. He turned to another illustration. A wool blanket shown close up, the weave drawn carefully. He could almost feel it through the page. Under the picture, the text read, "Wool is the memory of warmth. It once grew in wind and weather, now it offers shelter." He ran his hand over the actual blanket again and smiled. He turned another page. The illustration was of a small bowl of honey, golden and thick, with a spoon resting in it. The text described honey as summer held in a jar, sweetness that took patience to make. It spoke of bees moving carefully from flower to flower, gathering tiny gifts and turning them into something that could comfort a person in winter. He glanced at the honey jar on the table, the spoon glistening. The thought of summer existing inside it made him feel quietly hopeful, as if the world had planned kindness in advance. He turned another page. The illustration showed a lamp with a fabric shade, light spilling like cream onto a table. The text described soft light as light that does not demand your attention, only your ease. He looked up at the nearest lamp. The shade was slightly crooked, as if adjusted by hand rather than perfectly aligned. That imperfection made it feel more tender, less like a showroom and more like a home. He turned another page. The story described the moment when the traveler began to doze. Their eyes would close for a few seconds, then open again to read one more paragraph, then close again. The shopkeeper noticed and did not interrupt. The shopkeeper simply turned the stove down slightly so the room wouldn't get too hot, and placed a second blanket nearby in case the traveler wanted it. He realized with a small start that a second blanket had appeared on the arm of the chair beside him, a lighter one knitted, the color of pale oatmeal. He hadn't noticed it earlier. Maybe it had been there. Maybe it hadn't. The shop was the kind of place where such details didn't feel suspicious. They felt like care arriving quietly. He reached out and touched the knitted blanket. It was soft, almost velvety, and it smelled faintly like soap and lavender. He draped it over his shoulders on top of the wool, not because he was cold, but because it felt like being layered in safety. He returned to the book. The book for sleep now described the shop's oldest shelf, the one kept near the stove so the cold wouldn't creep into its wood. On that shelf were books that had been read by hundreds of tired people. Their pages were slightly softened by touch, their spines bent in familiar ways. The shopkeeper called them the well-loved medicines. He glanced around and noticed a shelf near the stove with older books indeed, spines faded, titles worn. Some had small patches of cloth where they'd been repaired. Their presence made him feel oddly comforted. Here were books that had survived many winters and many sleepless nights. Here were stories that had held people and had not worn out from the holding. He wondered how many tired hands had turned pages in this chair. The thought didn't feel intrusive. It felt communal in a quiet way, like sharing a fireplace in a storm. He read another page and found the words, "If you are reading this and you feel your thoughts slowing, you have done enough for tonight. Done enough." The phrase settled into him like warm tea. He let his eyes close for a moment. He could still feel the book's weight in his lap, the slight pressure of it He could still hear the stove. He could smell paper and honey and wool. The shop seemed to cradle his senses, giving each of them something gentle to hold, so his mind didn't have to scramble for distractions. When he opened his eyes again, the lines on the page had shifted slightly in his focus. He blinked slowly until they sharpened. He read on. The traveler in the story asked the shopkeeper one more question. "Do you think I'll sleep tonight?" The shopkeeper answered. "Sleep is not a test you can fail. If you rest, you have already succeeded." He felt that sentence travel through him like warmth. Sleep is not a test you can fail. How many nights had he treated it like one? How many mornings had he woken angry at himself for not doing it right? As if sleep were an exam and his body a disappointing student. He swallowed, and his eyes stung slightly, not with sadness, but with relief. He turned the page and found a full-page illustration of snow falling outside a window. The scene was quiet, the world softened by white. In the corner of the illustration, inside the window, a small cup sat on a table, steam rising. The contrast between cold outside and warmth inside was drawn with such tenderness that it almost felt like a promise. Winter can be held at a distance. You can be safe. He looked out the actual window. The snow was thicker now, the street beyond almost erased. The world looked simpler, reduced to light and shadow and falling softness. He felt his breath match the snow's pace, slow and steady. He read the next page. The text was even gentler now, as if the book itself were lowering its voice. The sentences were shorter. The rhythm was soothing. It described the traveler's head tipping slightly to one side, their hand loosening on the page. It described the moment when reading became less about understanding and more about being lulled by the cadence of words. It described how the shopkeeper quietly placed a bookmark where the traveler stopped, not wanting them to lose their place, not wanting them to feel they had to start over. He glanced down. His hand was indeed loosening. The book felt heavier, though it was the same book. His muscles were simply less engaged. The weight was not unpleasant. It was like the pleasant heaviness of a quilt. He found himself thinking briefly about his own bed at home, how it sometimes felt too wide, too empty, too full of his thoughts. But tonight, the idea of going home didn't feel daunting. The calm he was gathering here felt portable, like warmth caught in wool. He wondered drowsily the shop would still be here tomorrow. Then he remembered the earlier words. It's here when it needs to be. That felt like enough. The shop didn't need to be a permanent address on a map. It was a kind of shelter that appeared in the right moments. He turned another page. The illustration showed a small bookmark, a strip of cloth with a stitched moon at the end. The text read, "Leave your place marked. The story will wait. You do not have to finish anything tonight." He exhaled. His eyes softened. The shopkeeper's footsteps approached again, very quiet. He didn't look up immediately, too comfortable to move. A gentle hand, warm, careful, rested briefly on the edge of the table, not touching him, simply placing something down. When he lifted his gaze, he saw a small moon-stitched bookmark lying beside his cup. It looked exactly like the one in the illustration. His mouth opened slightly in surprise, but the surprise felt like a lullaby too. He picked up the bookmark. The cloth was soft, and the stitched moon was slightly raised beneath his fingertip. The shopkeeper whispered, "For you, so you don't have to worry about losing your place." "Thank you," he whispered back. The shopkeeper nodded, and their expression held a kind of fondness that asked nothing in return. They returned to the counter, leaving him with the small moon in his hand. He slipped the bookmark between the pages where he'd been reading, though he hadn't truly lost his place. The gesture itself felt calming, as if he'd tied a loose end. He leaned back again. The blanket hugged his shoulders. The tea was nearly finished, but he didn't need more. His body felt warm all the way through, from fingertips to toes. He read one more page. The words were simple. When you are ready, you can close the book. When you are ready, you can close your eyes. The warmth will remain. He stared at those lines for a long moment. His eyes drifted over them again and again, as if each repetition smoothed the inside of his mind. He closed the book slowly, letting the cover settle with a soft thump that wasn't loud enough to break the room's hush. The act felt ceremonial, like closing a window gently against the cold. He placed the book on his lap and rested his hand on it, feeling its warmth through the cloth cover. He looked around one last time, letting the shop imprint itself on him. The shelves, the lamps, the stove, the quiet counter where the shopkeeper sat reading. Everything seemed wrapped in a velvety softness, as if the air itself were made of felt. His eyes found the window again. Snow fell and fell. The world outside was patient. was simply a blanket of ours, and he was allowed to be held by it. He let his eyes close. For a moment, he still heard the stove crackle. He still smelled paper and honey. He still felt wool and knit against his skin. The shop seemed to breathe with him, slow and steady. In the darkness behind his eyelids, a soft image drifted up. The fox curled around a lantern, the lantern's light gentle and safe. He held that image without effort, like holding a warm stone. The shopkeeper's voice came from far away, or perhaps from somewhere inside the warmth itself, so quiet it might have been the rustle of a page. Rest now. The door will be here when you need it again. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His breathing deepened, slow and even. The day slipped away like a coat being hung up. Thoughts that had been sharp became rounded, then faded. The last thing he felt was the steady weight of the blanket and the steady kindness of the room. Outside, snow kept falling, making the world softer with every flake. Inside, the little bookshop stayed open, always open, in the way that mattered for anyone who needed peace. And he, at last, drifted